tradition says, right, that the Torah has 70 faces, right, which is to say that there are endless ways of understanding our tradition, right, and also that our tradition needs to be understood and re-understood in every generation, right? So we are not just studying for our own edification, right? We are also part of the larger Jewish project of reinterpreting Torah in every generation. Yeah, go ahead.
And it's a really stupid question. What's the difference between Torah, Talmud, and Gemara?
Great. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So we'll start with a few. Well, I'm sorry. Okay. Good. All right. So let's start with a few definitions, right? And these are a little complicated, right? But so the first thing to know is that Torah can mean everything from the 5 books of Moses that are found in the Torah scroll that's here in the Ark to the entirety of the Jewish tradition, right? So Torah has this very capacious definition and this very narrow tradition.
Because I only do the narrow.
Exactly. So people will say, when like I was at a training for rabbis the other day about how to use Zoom. Clearly, I'm still a neophyte. And he, and the guy was saying, the Torah that you're offering, right, is what really matters, right? And so the people's experience of Zoom should be such that they have full access because it shouldn't. And he was saying, you don't use the word virtual because it's completely Torah. It's not virtual Torah, right? Virtual Torah means kind of Torah, right? It's real Torah that you're offering, right? But you're doing it in a digital context, right? So it's not virtual. It's not virtual services. It's digital services. Okay, I get it. I get the semantics, right? But when he said Torah, he didn't mean the portion of the Torah that you're going to read for the book. He meant all the teaching that you as a rabbi are going to do, right? That's called Torah. All right. So that's the first definition. The second definition is what is Talmud, right? Talmud means sort of two things. Talmud Torah is in general the study of Torah. So Talmud and Torah in the larger sense, right? So Talmud derives from the root lamed mem daled, which you can hear in Talmud, right? Which is that's the root for learning, right? And for teaching. So, and that's the other important thing, that's one of the reasons we're always supposed to do things in pairs, because everyone is supposed to simultaneously be a teacher and a learner at the same time, right? So that is Talmud Torah, basically means learning anything that's in the tradition. The narrow definition is the Talmud, of which there, of course, we're Jews, so there has to be two, right? 2 Talmuds. So the first one to come along is called the Jerusalem Talmud, 5th century, 5th century. It was closed, and then the Babylonian Talmud, more 6th, 7th. And the Babylonian Talmud is the one that we're more familiar with. It's the one that's most. But when we say just Talmud, we mean the Babylonian Talmud. That's what we're looking at today. The Talmud has 2 components. The first component is the Mishnah, and the Mishnah was a kind of a law code that was written down in about 200, around the year 200 BC of the Common Era, 200 of the Common Era. The tradition assigns the authorship to the person called Rabbi. He's given just the name Rabbi, and he so he supposedly, right, codified all of the various traditions from what are called the Tannaitic generation, and that would be from like a little bit before the beginning of the Common Era to about 200 of the Common Era, right? That generation of scholars. And so we'll see here right, that the first one says Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan was one of the Tanaim, one of the Tanas. And then the Talmud, right, is based on the Mishnah. So each tractate of the Talmud has a base text, which is the Mishnah of the corresponding tractate, and there's a little bit of the Mishnah gets written, and then you move to the and then you move into the Gemara, right? Which is the if I'm remembering correctly, Gemara is the Aramaic word for learning. So it's just the same idea, right? So what do we learn? And the Gemara includes later discussions of the Tanaitic material that's in the Mishnah, but it also brings in other material, right? Other material that's Tanaitic that wasn't included in the Mishnah. And so you get to witness the rabbis doing their favorite thing, which is to say, in the Mishnah, we have Rabbi Yochanan saying X. In this other outside tradition, and that's called a Baraita, we have Rabbi Yochanan saying Y. X and Y are incompatible. Which one does Rabbi Yochanan mean? And then we have Gemara, right? And eventually they decide, that, well, Rabbi Yochanan said X in this context, but he said Y in this other context. And that's how we harmonize what appears, but only appears to be a contradiction, right? And then later generations will say, no, they were wrong, right? So the thing to remember about Talmud, right, is that it is simultaneously, the Netflix or the web surfing of the rabbis, right? They do it for fun, right? But it's also deadly serious, right? It's also about, well, what is the law? What is finally the thing that how are we actually supposed to live, right? So I'll show you this. So this is the Talmud. This is the first tractate of the Talmud Bavli, right? The Babylonian Talmud. And the people I'm going to show it, Suzanne and Sandy, to the people in the room. And then if you're interested, I'll show it to you later. Okay, so here is the first block of Mishnah, right? And then over here is Rashi's commentary on the Mishnah, and here is other commentaries and more commentaries, right? And notes, right? And then right here you see it's a little bigger. You see a Gimel Mem. That's the beginning of the Gemara.
Confusing.
Yeah, and then you've got the Gemara. Yeah.
Wasn't the Gemara actually the written word?
I can't see it.
Oh, you can't. It's too small.
What was done orally prior to it?
Yes, everything
So
here.
all oral laws were finally written.
Right, the Talmud. So that's actually a very important point, right? Is that one of the other ways of understanding Talmud, understanding Torah, right? Is that we've got the written Torah. That's what's in the 5 books of Moses, and then we have the oral Torah, right? Which in the rabbinic tradition is equally sacred, right? It comes down from God, right? And that is and that's why the Gemara is so complicated, right? Because oral traditions have a tendency there's a little bit of the game of telephone coming down, right? So when we get to the point where we're going to write it down, we might already have different versions, or actually we often have different versions, sometimes more than 2, right? And so one of the very interesting things about the Talmud is that sometimes it'll be very clear. It'll say Hilkata Ka, which means that the ruling goes according to the way this or that rabbi saw it. But sometimes there will not be such a statement, right? Meaning that in certain, you have to work a little harder to figure out, well, what does the Talmud actually think the rule is? But a lot of stuff that's in the Talmud is not actually legal material, right? A lot of it is midrash. So someone asked about what is midrash. Midrash comes from the root dalid resh shin, which means to sort of demand. So midrash basically means you're demanding that the text offer you some meaning, right? So you've got this text that doesn't seem to have that much significance. What meaning do we make out of this text? Another thing, right, is that, well, wait a second. Here we have Joseph as a young boy, and the next time he ends up in Potiphar's house. What happens in between? Right? How did that all happen? Right? What little holes that might be in the text of the in the text of the Torah. So that's often what midrash is, and very often you get the sense with the rabbis, right, is that they have an idea about what they want the text to mean, and they spend a lot of time figuring out how they can justify that. Right? They have a lot of fun. Right? So the thing to remember, right, is that just with the Talmud, right, things are very often midrash is dead serious. But midrash can also be completely playful, right? Sometimes even the same time that is being deadly serious, right? So it can be a little whiplash when you're reading midrash. And there's modern midrash, right? If anyone has read The Red Tent by Anita Diamond, right? That's a midrash. It's an extended midrash about the biblical first family, right? And the characters are very different in many ways in her midrash than they are in the Bible. And you might say to her, Anita, I can say I know her, so I can call her Anita. Anita, how can you make these characters so different than the way they are? They seem to be in the Bible itself. And she'll say, well, is that any different than what the rabbis did? And the answer is no, right? The characters in the midrash are often very different than the characters as presented in the Torah. Right? In the midrash, they tend to be much more idealized. In the Torah, they tend to be much more sort of psychologically realistic. All right. So, any other preliminary questions before we move to the text? Did I cover all the questions that were asked? I think I did.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so let's look here. So Rabbi Yochanan, I said before, right, that Rabbi Yochanan is the Tana. He is.
Oh, Sandy is getting dinner.
It's good. I just muted Sandy so she can talk to her person. Okay, great. All right. So 3 people, Rabbi Yochanan said. So the other. So I said already, there's a lot of legal material. Right? There's a lot of midrash in the Talmud, right? So you'll often find if you're looking at midrash collections, very often they won't point you to a collection of midrash when they cite a midrash on the Torah. They'll send you to a tractate of the Bavli, right? Because that's where you'll find it. The other thing that it has, and if anyone has studied with me tractate Avot, right? Sometimes it's called Pirkei Avot, right? Chapters of the fathers, right? There is sort of ethical texts, right? So a lot of the ethical texts are sort of like proverbs, right? Or advice, right? So here in this part of Pesachim, right, which is the tractate that's devoted to what, do you think?
Pesach.
To Pesach, right? It's where, the very origins, the sort of nebulous origins of the Seder are in Pesachim, and there are some pieces of what we see in the Haggadah that come directly from Mishnah Pesachim, and so it's really interesting, for instance, to compare the 4 questions, right? The 4 questions that are in Mishnah Pesachim and the 4 questions that you find in the Haggadah aren't the same.
Oh.
So what gives, right? Very interesting to look at. So anyway, but the text that I brought today come from a series of passages here, right, that talk about advice. Who are the right kind of people? Who are the best kind of people? Who are the worst kind of people? Go ahead.
I was just wondering, are there differences in the 4 questions between the Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and Mizrahi? Or are they always the same 4,
No,
given the 3 different origins here?
that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I assume, perhaps unwisely, but I'm going to take a guess and we can try to figure it out later. I'm going to assume that the Haggadah was set before those major cultural differences really set in.
Okay.
But again, we might want to be careful about making that assumption.
I can tell you the food is different.
The food is definitely different, but in general, styles of food change a little bit more quickly than the written text that we look at. Although you might not know that now, given the number of Haggadahs that are available. So, all right. So Rabbi Yochanan said, 3 people are among those who inherit the world to come. One, and just to know that the rabbis love 3, right? They love 3s. And if they have 4, they'll come up with 2 more so they can have 2 sets of 3 rather than a set of 4. Right? They love 3s. All right. So one who lives in Eretz Yisrael, right? One who raises his sons to engage in Torah study, and one who recites Havdalah over wine at the conclusion of Shabbat. All right. So this is in the Mishnah, I guess, of Pesachim. All right. So let's just stop for a minute, and I'll just let you know that I have not done a tremendous amount of pre-reading on this, so I'm not coming to this with an idea of I know what it means. Right? This is really a chance to read together. Right? What do we see here? And so I obviously have a little bit of background on this text, but not a lot. So let's read the rest, and we'll see what we think. And the Gemara asks, what is the special importance of that mitzvah? Meaning the last mitzvah. Who cares about that one? Right? The Gemara answers, this is referring to an individual with only a small amount of wine, who nevertheless leaves some of his Kiddush wine for Havdalah. All right. So you get some of the idea of how the Talmud works, right? So for the Gemara, right, and when we say the Gemara, generally what this means is that there's a kind of the anonymous voice of the Gemara. Right? Sometimes there's a name, but this is sort of like the narrator. He's sort of like the master of ceremonies, right? And very often, and he asks, generally, the questions tend to be somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? They tend to be just lead-ups to the answer, right? I think that's, I was going to say it's a rhetorical question, but I think a rhetorical question isn't expecting an answer, right? Here, it's the opposite, right? They are expecting an answer, and they kind of already know what the answer is. Right. So so 3 people are among those who inherit the world to come. One who lives in Eretz Yisrael, right, in the land of Israel. One who raises his kids to study Torah, and one who does this business of, if they don't have enough wine, they leave some. Right, they don't drink it all on Shabbos. They leave some for Havdalah. All right. So I just now open this to reactions.
2 things.
Yeah.
So for those of us who don't know what Havdalah is,
Okay. So Havdalah, sorry about this. Havdalah is the series of blessings that is said at the end of Shabbat that in a certain way correspond to the blessings that are said at the beginning of Shabbat. So you welcome Shabbat in, right? And then you accompany Shabbat on the way out the door.
Nice.
Right.
You've been
And
to a party and
it's actually a great opportunity to have a party because you can do all kinds of things after Shabbat that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. So you get to celebrate Shabbat and then do all the things that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. Right? So turn on the television or play music, right? I don't know, but yeah. So anyway, but go ahead, Naomi.
No, I just, 2 things about this, but I can remember when a couple of us were smokers and you would keep sending a kid outside to see if the stars, because Shabbos, then you could start to smoke again.
Right,
You can't smoke on Shabbos.
Shabbat.
right,
Yeah.
right. That's exactly right.
But we would say, we kept sending one of the kids to
Oh,
two stars, yeah. But no, you've got two things here immediately. Three people are among those.
Yes.
In other words, they're not the only ones.
These are not the only ones, right?
And-
Very important, right? That is made quite clear.
And then there is this world to come, which Judaism supposedly has some ambivalence about.
Yeah, right,
Uh,
right. Now, what I probably can say, right, that Rabbi Yochanan probably didn't have a lot of ambivalence about the world to come, right? Because Rabbi Yochanan was living in a time, right, when Judaism was split into a variety of different sects, including Christians, right? And one of the things that was, that Judaism really was struggling with, right, was this transition to a world that was from the biblical world, where there really wasn't an afterlife, to the post-biblical world where many people believe there was, right? And so the world to come became very important for many Jews as a kind of the Christians believe this, so we should believe this too. Yeah, go ahead.
The Jews really did live among people who believed in an afterlife.
Yes.
The most startling example was the Egyptians.
Yes.
But I think that they ignored them, okay? Whereas later on, they were dragged hither and thither and they couldn't ignore them.
Right. And also, you are in a different system, right? Where it's in large measure your own people, right, who are believing in the world, in the afterlife. Whereas before, it's those people, we don't want to be like those people,
Yeah.
right? We want to be like our people. So don't believe in the afterlife, right? I don't know if this is historically true, but in Anita Diamond's book, for instance, right, the Egyptians have dinner and the women and the men sit together at dinner, right? So the Canaanites, the family of Dinah, right, they would never do that, right? The women sit by themselves and the men sit by themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's, and so like it's, you want to set yourself apart from the other people, right? We tend to be more that way today, right? So today, a lot of Jews don't want to believe in the afterlife because that's what the Christians believe. So we dafka don't believe in an afterlife, right? This was a little different, right? And also they were struggling with the reality that we could no longer say, right, that we will get our reward if we live according to the rules. We'll get our reward in this life, right? Because we already know with the destruction of the temple and all kinds of other horrible things that happened to the Jews, right? That clearly, if that were true, then we were really terrible people and we were wrong, and we actually don't think that, right? So we need to put our reward off until later, right? But that's a very good point. But that's part of the reason, Naomi, why there's so much ambivalence about it, right? But it's true ambivalence. It's not like, I don't really like it, but we have to have it. It's really ambivalence. Yeah, go ahead, Shirley.
I know it says 3 people, but one person could be all these things.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So that's a wonderful point, right? So what does it mean, right? That you just need to do one of these things and you're good, right?
Mhm.
Right? I think it's such a fascinating text because these 3 things are at very different levels, right? One thing, I mean, imagine, like in that time, right? It wasn't so simple to live in Eretz Israel. The vast majority of Jews lived in exile, right, after the destruction of the temple, right? So living there is like a big sacrifice, right? Teaching your kids, and I'm going to say kids because that's how we think about it today. Back then, there were women who learned Torah, but they were relatively few and far between if we are to understand the Talmud, right? So the emphasis was on the sons, God willing, we've, even in the Orthodox world, that's beginning to change pretty significantly. But that's also a big commitment, right? It's not as big of a commitment, right, as uprooting yourself and moving to Eretz Yisrael, but it's a big deal, right? And this is why I think the Gemara is like, wait, all you have to do is say Havdalah? I mean, like you don't have to move to Israel. You don't have to teach your kids Torah. All you have to do is what? That is crazy. Right? And so very often that's what the texts of the Gemara are pointing out, logical inconsistencies or inconsistencies in terms of degree, right? These are three categories of person who deserves to enter Ha'olam Haba, right? The world to come, right? We already established that these are not the only ways, but these are three of the ways. But wait, these are completely incompatible as regards the level of commitment and cost, so to speak.
Which is why it seems to me, at least, to imply that you do not have to do all three.
Oh, yes, right?
That one out of three will be fine.
Right.
And a lot of the grammar here implies that 1 out of 3 is good.
Right.
Well, some of them, like some of the family think, some of the kids could learn the whole thing, and the other family don't have to do it. They don't have to be a religious other part to learn about it.
Right.
They could learn about it and have to know the whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So what you're pointing to, right, is a kind of, I hesitate to say pluralism, right? But there is a way in which here, hi, Marha, come on in. There is a way in which, right, this sort of notion that we hear about from time to time from people, you can't pick and choose. Well, you're going to be a cafeteria Catholic? You're going to pick what you want to do and what you don't want to do, and like it's up to you, right? Well, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, look, not everybody can actually move to Eretz Yisrael, right? Not everybody actually can afford to send their kids to day school, right? Like sending them to college is going to be a challenge. Not much less, 12 years of college level tuition for day school, right? And those people, right, who don't have that kind of a resource, right? The fact that they actually hang on to meaningful traditions in their home, right? That's enough to get them to heaven.
If it exists.
But you don't have to even send your kid to day school.
No.
You can teach your kid at home.
Exactly. Right.
Well, that's what they did back then.
Yes,
anyway.
exactly.
Right. Exactly. Right. There was right. Whether there were
people who lived in the rabbi's house. Well, I guess that came later.
that probably came later. I mean, and again, one thing that is very easy for us to get hung up on is some sort of idea of the historical reality.
Yeah.
Right. Poor Suzanne left. I'm still working on these hybrid programs. I meant to have my thing here so that people could see me. Sorry. I don't have a paper for everyone, Maury, so you'll have to be in range of the screen. So I lost my train of thought there. But right, so it's very well attested in Judaism, right, that no one Jew is expected to fulfill all the mitzvot, right? And we have this idea, right, both from our current cultural climate, right, of religion as an all or nothing thing, right, and from the I don't mean to sort of generalize, right, but the the creation of orthodoxy from when Reform Judaism came into existence, the reaction among traditionalists was to form orthodoxy, right? Which is very different than traditional Judaism. So what you have in the Talmud is traditional Judaism, right? This notion that you don't actually need to do all three of these things. One is enough, right? When by the time we get to the 18th century and orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy says, no, you got to do everything, right? And nothing ever changes, right? And so that's a very different orientation than what you see in the Talmud. All right, so let's move on to the next one. And I think we're going to have to continue this next week because I don't think we're going to get through the whole thing.
No, not at all.
All right, so Rabbi Yochanan further said, the Holy One of Blessing, I don't say the Holy One, blessed be He, because I really don't buy that that the deity has a gender, but the word in Hebrew is Hakadosh Baruch Hu, so a literal translation is the Holy One, blessed be He, right? Because in Hebrew, right, there is only masculine and feminine, right? And it would be even weirder to say Brucha He, right? Blessed be she, right? Because then you are definitely assigning a gender, right? Because in Hebrew, the masculine grammatical gender contains both feminine and masculine people, right? If you don't know a gender of a person, you say, who is he? Right? Me who, right? If you, right, that who in English, what do we say? Who were they? Who were they? Right? We say they, right? We move to the plural, right?
It used to be, who is he,
Right.
included both.
Right. It used to be, right? That was whatever, 50 years ago. It was still pretty accepted, right? That man, when you said man, you meant humankind, right?
Yeah.
Today, languages change, right? You know why does the language change? Because it's language. It changes, right? Shakespeare was very, very comfortable with the uncertain gender they, right? That was just part of Shakespeare's language. It became much less so for us, and then it's come back. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But just to know because you see this expression all the time in Talmud and Midrash, when you don't say God's name, you say Hakadosh Baruch Hu. It's a euphemism for God because you don't want to use God's name, and by the time of the rabbis, the word Elohim, right, which means God, had become a name for God. So you don't say Elohim in rabbinic texts. You say something like this, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. All right. Very important here, right, that the Holy One, blessed be He, proclaims about the goodness of three kinds of people every day. B'chol yom. B'chol yom, which I think is really interesting, right? And it would really be fascinating to do a little study about what are the things that God does every day. What's the range of things?
It's a wonderful cartoon.
What?
There's a
Really?
wonderful cartoon about that.
Oh, really?
Oh, this?
Yeah, God had all sorts of great intentions for the seventh day, but he was just so tired that he decided to screw this. I'm going to stay in bed.
Yes.
Can't
Right.
hear her.
What she said, Sandy, was that there's a joke about God who had all kinds of wonderful plans for what he was going to do in the first on Shabbos, on the seventh day. But when the seventh day came, God was so tired that God had to rest.
That's why they said 7 days.
Right.
And
6
relax
days you
on
do
the eighth,
6 days you do your work. On the seventh
and
you
then
should
you relax.
you relax. Exactly.
Stay in bed.
Yeah.
But I love the idea, right, that every day God is going to proclaim, right? He's machriz, he's gonna shout out, he's gonna celebrate, right, the goodness of three kinds of people. And the gloss here says that they are exceptional and noteworthy. Okay. All right, very interesting. About a bachelor who lives in a city and does not sin. Okay.
Doesn't say does not sin with women. Another
Well,
put down.
that's what it says in the English. And I think that they're right. I think that is what it means. But again, what they have in mind here is sexual sin, right?
Of course.
Does not, right. Okay. So where there's, a person that lives in a city where there's a lot of temptation, right, to spend time with prostitutes as opposed to doing your Torah study, right? So God is always happy when there's the unusual man, right, who keeps himself in check. Okay. About a poor person who returns a lost object to its owners, despite being poor, right? You might think that a person who's poor, finds money, he needs money, right? But when that person doesn't succumb to that temptation, right, and returns the money to its owner, right, God is really happy about that behavior. And about a wealthy person who, hold on, tithes his produce in private without publicizing his behavior. Okay. All right, so let's stop. Oh, actually, we can continue just because we won't have much. We'll have to pick this up next time, but we can at least get this whole little piece in. So the Gemara reports Rav Safra was a bachelor living in a city. Okay, we're gonna stop. When the Tana taught this baraita before Rava and Rav Safra's face lit up with joy as he was listed among those praised by God. But Rava said to him, sorry, Charlie, don't get ahead of yourself. This does not refer to someone like the master, like you, right?
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. This does not refer to someone like the master. Like as in the Senate, right? My esteemed colleague from New York. Rather, the statement applies to people like Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya, who were cobblers in Eretz Yisrael, and they would sit in the marketplace of prostitutes and fashion shoes for prostitutes. And the prostitutes would enter their shops and look at them. However, due to their piety, these sages did not raise their eyes to look at the women.
Oh gosh.
And those prostitutes were so impressed with this behavior that when they would swear, right, when they would make a shavua, when they wanted to promise that they were going to do something, right, what would they swear on? They would say as follows: by the lives of the holy sages of Eretz Yisrael, right, is this type of bachelor who is saved, praised by heaven. Right? It's not about a bachelor, right, who is and this, I'll just say that this, we can talk about it, but the basic understanding here, right, is it's not actually about a bachelor who doesn't sleep with prostitutes, right? It's actually about someone who works for prostitutes, right? Works with sex workers, doesn't judge them, doesn't sleep with them, doesn't take advantage of them, but rather makes shoes for them, right? Purovides for them, right? And so it's very different than what you might think, right? It's not this puffy Rav Safra who's like, oh, I live in the city and I don't go to the brothel. I am one of the people that God is so excited about, right? And the Gemara is like, no. If you were like Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya, who like another big hero of an important religious text who went and hung out with sex workers. Who might that be?
Oh,
He's a minor figure in the world. His name is Jesus of Nazareth.
I was thinking of Joshua and the whore at the.
That's right.
wall.
Oh, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So always, so as in the Bible, right? As in the Bible, when remember that these texts often play with cultural stereotypes, right? And they often want to subvert them, right? So in the Bible, right, there's this prostitute, and Joshua ends up, according to the tradition, she's the one that allows for the invasion of Jericho and ends up married to Joshua, right? Tamar, right, one of the great heroines of the Bible,
Yeah.
right, puts on a prostitute's garb and tricks Judah into sleeping with her. She's actually his daughter-in-law, right? And she becomes the ancestor of King David, right? So you have to be very careful in assuming, right, that when one of our texts talks about prostitutes, that they're necessarily adopting the sort of generalized cultural negativity about sex work. Not to say that they approve of it, right? But in these specific cases, right, they're not necessarily going there. Yeah, go ahead.
From the prostitute's point of view, I think that that God would be praising, or anybody could say that was praised for the wholesomeness that's restored by an act of piety
Right,
of others.
right. That they treat these women, right? They treat these women like people.
Yeah, they respect them.
They respect them, right? They don't demean them. They don't ogle them. They don't sleep with them, right? They don't exploit them, right? And so and these are people, as we know from our own culture, right? That sex workers are often the most exploitable people, right?
Yeah.
They're often the most vulnerable, right? And so the fact that these guys, so we can see, right, that at least this first one, right, about the bachelor who lives in the city, right, we can see that this is a very rare type of person.
Well, isn't bachelorhood also not something you're supposed to be? I mean, you're supposed to marry and be fruitful and multiply.
Right,
and,
exactly, right. And I think it's very important, right, to know that in a certain sense, even being a bachelor that's gonna get in the way of you getting to heaven or in having God praise your behavior, right? Because the first, as you said, Naomi, the first mitzvah in the Bible is pru urvu, right? The first thing that we're told to do is go out, be fruitful, and multiply, right? So being a bachelor is already a little dicey. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the word, I've always chafed a little bit with the word sin. I don't know all the connotations in
Is
Hebrew.
it 10 minutes of, no,
No, it's 5 minutes of 4. So we can finish up and just clear this up next week. Yeah.
I thought it was 4 to start each week.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I mistook the hour for starting here.
Yeah. Last week it started at 4. We moved it to 3 because the dinner now starts at 4.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So as I was saying on the point about the word sin, I've always retranslated that in my own mind as the way, the
Right.
path.
Right.
So the path, Judaism talks about propriety of the way you go, that and behavior, etc. But so it's two ways. I mean, here that person doesn't fulfill maybe the commandment for procreation, which is another discussion, but also doesn't go in the way of not procreating in the wrong way.
Right.
okay.
And it's not kosher to sleep with prostitutes in the Jewish system, right? I mean, certainly there's some sort of moral problem, but also the bigger problem generally, as I understand it, I may be wrong, I don't want to like insist on this, but a big part of the problem is that cultic prostitution was a part of the religious behavior of the surrounding people. And so it wasn't so much, right, that you were having sex outside of marriage, it was that you were having sex in a way that resembled pagan worship, right? That's sort of really not, and I will just add, Maury, that I agree with you about the chet, about the sinning, right? And so we tend to see sin in this country in a Christian sense, right? The word chet and we were talking about this in the bar and bat mitzvah group. You know, the word sin in most Jewish texts is, well, there's avon, but chet is the one that we're most used in this. That's the one that's used here, right? That really means, you know, it's sort of the general way of understanding is that it's missing the mark, right? That we've missed the mark, right? We shot our arrow, and I wanted to hit a bullseye, and instead I didn't even get anywhere close to the target, right? It assumes a couple of things. First of all, it assumes, right, that the person is trying, right? That the person is trying to do the right thing, right? And I do think that in our sort of culture, right, we have an epidemic of assuming the worst about people's motivations as opposed to assuming the best, right? And the other thing, right, is that it's, you know, in the kind of archery metaphor, right, is that you have to constantly practice, right? You don't just show up, you know, pick up the bow, pick up the arrow, pull it back, and hit a bullseye, right? You got to work on it, right? It's a constant practice of improving your aim, right? You get better and better over time. Yeah, go ahead.
It was mentioned in a different respect, but it really is inclusive. In my view, to the whole thing about creation of, be creative and multiply. I said to another rabbi, I says, it really says, in my mind, another thing that says, I'll use my own words, be creative and then, the missing conjunctive, and then multiply, not just, but on the word create is another augmentation of the theme of which direction you should be going in.
Right.
And what's required, what work is involved in creation.
Right.
And then multiply.
Right. And I love that, because I think that in many families, right, where there's a sort of a kind of almost, I mean, I don't like to call any Jew a fundamentalist, but where there's a more fundamentalist understanding of the mitzvahs, right? People get very caught up, right, in, wait, you can't marry a man, right?
Yeah.
Because then you won't be able to procreate, right? As though the only way to be fruitful and procreate, right, is to have children. Right? I mean, obviously, it is a way. It's probably, you know, it's the most fundamental way. It's the whatever, right? And it's a great way for those of us who were lucky enough to be parents. But does that mean that everyone who wasn't lucky enough to become a parent, or who didn't want to become a parent, or, you know, was unable to become a parent, is thus a sinner? Like that I can't see God making a world that way. Right, so there must be other ways, right, to pur or vu. Yeah, go ahead.
Getting back to the concept of sin.
Yeah.
Or isn't that whenever you do something counter to the Ten Commandments?
Well, that's a really interesting question,
Yeah.
right? That's a really interesting. I don't know that particular tradition, right? But what I would say, right, is that the one of the biggest, we already sort of established, right, that no one Jew can fulfill all the mitzvahs, right? But part of that, right, is because sometimes there are two mitzvahs that are really completely in conflict with one another,
Contradictory.
right?
Mhm.
That you can't do one and also do the other. So each Jew ends up in a situation where he or she needs to decide, which am I going to do, right? Which is the one that for me is more meaningful, more valuable, more important, right? Is it more important? For instance, like just to take a kind of everyday kind of example, is it more important, right, for me to eat food, if I want to eat meat, is it more important that I eat meat that has been certified kosher, right, by the rabbis? Or is it more important that I eat, grass-fed organic beef, right, that is, takes care of the environment and is humane to the animal, right? Those two things are not always coterminous, right? And Bal Tashit, don't make an animal suffer versus you want to eat kosher food, right? We're all forced, right, to make a decision. If those are two values that are extremely important to us, we often need to decide between them. And I'm not here to say that you should choose one or you should choose the other, but I am saying like it's not always possible to do both.
I'll give you an example. My daughter has a kosher home. Her son has allergies to peanuts and tree nuts. And sometimes they had to buy the non-kosher because that's what he could eat.
Right.
Because the kosher he could not.
Right.
So that's
And that would
exactly
that would probably be a pikuach nefesh, right? Yeah. This idea that you would do digging on Shabbat in order to save a person's life.
Yeah.
So you will break one very important commandment in order to fulfill another, even more important commandment. Yeah, go ahead, Maria. Then we got to stop because I got to get on another call.
Okay. Well, one of the principles in my mind that comes from what I would consider somewhat of a principle, but after a few days, I might downgrade my thought to different thinking, is to distinguish between what is the majority thinking insofar as the question at hand, such as given here, and what is the exception that's come to play thereafter.
Right.
But in terms of this discussion, I think that we can't confuse the two.
I mean, majority opinion is always very, very important, but it's also very important in our tradition that we maintain the minority opinion.
I don't disagree.
Right? Because the minority opinion may be...
It's naturally evolved.
Right.
But the question is not to substitute one for the other.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Shirley. You want to say something?
When they did the commentary and wrote these, the Talmud and everything, the rabbis or whomever literally went over every single letter of every word, and depending on how it was written, it had a different meaning.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes they were willing in the Midrash, right, to say, don't read it the way that it's written in the tradition.
Yeah.
Read it this other way,
Yeah.
and then you'll get a different meaning. So when that's kosher and when that's not kosher, of course, is an interesting question, right? So anyway, so we have to end. So Connie, unfortunately, we started at 3 today, not at 4. So I apologize. I had it that way in my email, but I'm not sure that
3 o'clock.
Yes.
Yeah, we started at 3, and I'm sorry, my day was so completely crunched that I didn't have a chance to send out a reminder. If you would,
It's in the book, it's in what Laura Baber wrote.
that she wrote 3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, great. So Connie, I will send you and Marjorie and Maury, I'm happy to send you the YouTube link so you can watch this discussion if you're interested in it. And I need to apologize to Suzanne because she was on for a while, but I put my computer aside and I realized that she wasn't able to see my face. So she probably was, annoyed at looking at the side of my head and gave up. So I have to apologize to her for that. But thank you, everybody, for coming. This was great. We will continue.
Yes.
Next week, we'll continue. I'll bring some new texts but we'll continue with the rest of this one because we still have to figure out about these poor, the poor people, the poor guy and the rich guy. So,
Yeah, next
thank you,
Thank you
Sandy.
very much. And the
Thank you.
position of women is abhorrent.
Did he say he has the?
Okay, thanks, Connie. I'll send you the link.
Has 5 sentences, and it covers
I don't have
over
a pen
700
problem.
years.
Go in your copy
And
hole.
it starts with
This
God
one in
gave
my
the
copy?
Torah to Moses,
Okay.
and
So that's where
Moses
you
gave
put
it
you.
to him,
Okay.
and he gave it to him.